In a forgotten riverfront town, a desperate journalist was about to bid 50 cents on a condemned hotel. What started as a search for redemption took a shocking turn when she discovered a voice calling from the walls, a woman who had been buried alive for 62 years. Riley Hartman wasn't your typical bargain hunter. For years she had spent her life exposing fraudulent schemes as an investigative travel writer, known for her refusal to let sleeping secrets lie. When she broke through the sealed service passage and heard Agnes Vale's plea for help, she had no idea she was walking into a conspiracy that spanned 3 generations. Riley made a choice that would lead to the unraveling of an entire town's silence. What began as a 50-cent gamble would become a reckoning with buried truth. The Riverside Grand Hotel would never be the same after the guest no innkeeper dared to house finally told her story, and 7 shallow graves revealed the cost of keeping it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Riley Hartman had thought she understood desperation until the morning she bid 50 cents on a collapsed hotel and won. The county auctioneer had looked at her with something between pity and disbelief when her voice rang out across the courthouse steps. No one else had raised a hand. The crowd of locals stood silent, their faces turning toward her with expressions that made her skin prickle despite the warm afternoon sun. The Riverside Grand Hotel had once been the jewel of this small town, its Art Deco facade overlooking the slow-moving waters that gave the place its name. Built in 1923 during the final gasps of Prohibition glamour, it had hosted travelers, businessmen, and, according to whispered rumors, bootleggers and their associates. Now it stood as little more than a skeleton. Its eastern wing collapsed into rubble after years of neglect, its windows vacant and dark, like the eyes of something long dead. Riley signed the paperwork with hands that trembled slightly. The deed felt heavy in her grip, though it was just paper and ink. She had driven here from 3 states away after seeing the auction listing online, drawn by the promise of architectural salvage and the slim hope that she could restore something beautiful. After her exposé on the fraudulent resort chain had cost her both her career and her savings in legal fees, she needed this. She needed to prove she could still see value where others saw only ruin. Her brother Colt leaned against his truck in the parking lot, arms crossed over his chest, his mechanic's coveralls streaked with grease, despite it being his day off. He had driven up to talk her out of this, but one look at her face told him his words would be wasted. They had the same stubborn jaw, the same gray-green eyes that their mother had called stormy. When Riley set her mind to something, forces of nature had better step aside. 50 cents, Colt said as she approached. You know what that means, right? When something costs 50 cents at auction, it means nobody wants it, not even for scrap. Riley opened the passenger door and slid the deed into her backpack. It means I got a bargain. It means you got a problem. Colt glanced past her toward the courthouse steps, where clusters of townspeople still lingered, watching them. Look at their faces, Riley. These people aren't relieved someone bought that place. They're scared. She followed his gaze and felt that prickle again. An elderly woman in a floral dress clutched her purse tighter and turned away. A man in a feed store cap shook his head slowly, deliberately, as if Riley had just signed her own death warrant. A young mother pulled her child closer and whispered something that made the boy's eyes go wide. Local superstition, Riley said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. Every old building has its ghost stories. That's half the charm. Colt opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. He knew that tone. Instead, he climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. Fine. Let's go see what you bought. The drive from the courthouse to the riverfront took less than 10 minutes, winding through streets lined with brick storefronts and tired houses that had seen better decades. The town itself seemed to be holding its breath, as if waiting for something to finally break the oppressive quiet that hung over everything like humidity before a storm. The Riverside Grand Hotel came into view around a bend, and Riley felt her chest tighten with a mixture of excitement and dread. Even in ruins, it was magnificent. The main structure still stood 4 stories tall, its facade decorated with geometric patterns and stylized columns that spoke of an era when craftsmanship mattered. But the eastern wing had indeed collapsed, a tumble of brick and timber that spilled almost to the water's edge. Vines had claimed much of the exterior, and several windows on the upper floors were missing entirely, their frames gaping open to the elements. Colt parked in what had once been the circular drive. Weeds pushed through cracks in the old pavement, and a rusted iron gate hung at an angle from a single hinge. The property felt isolated despite being less than a mile from the town center. Trees crowded close on 3 sides, and the river moved slowly past the 4th, dark and silent. Riley stepped out of the truck and stood for a long moment, studying her purchase. The front entrance was still grand, twin doors of dark wood beneath an archway carved with roses and wheat sheaves. Someone had boarded the doors shut with rough planks, but time and weather had loosened the nails. She could smell old wood and river water, and something else, something like stone that had been damp for too long. "Riley," Colt said quietly. He had not moved from beside the truck. "I've got a bad feeling about this." "You've got a bad feeling about everything I do." "That's because everything you do is reckless." But he followed her toward the entrance anyway, pulling a crowbar from his toolkit. Brothers were like that, she thought. They complained and warned and predicted disaster, but they showed up when you needed them. The boards came away easier than Riley expected, as if they had been meant only as a suggestion rather than a true barrier. The doors beneath were unlocked, their brass handles tarnished black. Riley pushed, and they swung inward with a groan that seemed to echo through chambers beyond. The lobby took her breath away. Even in decay, it was beautiful. A grand staircase swept upward from the center of the room, its balustrade carved from dark wood, each post topped with a pineapple finial in the colonial style. The floor was laid in black and white marble tiles, many cracked or missing, but the pattern still visible beneath decades of dust and debris. High windows let in slanted afternoon light that illuminated columns of dust motes suspended in the air like stars. But the splendor was married to devastation. Plaster had fallen from the walls in great chunks, exposing the lath beneath. Water damage streaked everything in shades of brown and black. A chandelier lay shattered across the center of the floor, its crystal prisms scattered like offerings, and everywhere, absolutely everywhere, there was the smell of abandonment, of time and neglect, pressing down like a physical weight. Riley stepped carefully across the threshold. Her footsteps echoed too loudly in the silence. She had the sudden, irrational feeling that the building was listening, that her presence had awakened something that had been sleeping. "The structure looks unstable," Colt said from behind her. He was studying the ceiling with a professional eye. "See those cracks in the plaster? The framing underneath is probably rotted through. We shouldn't go any further without getting an engineer out here." "Just a quick look," Riley said. She moved toward the grand staircase, avoiding the debris. "I want to see the upper floors before dark." That was when she heard it. A sound from somewhere deeper in the building, past the lobby and through the darkened corridors beyond. Not the creak of settling wood or the scuttle of rats. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, as if someone was walking away from them, deeper into the hotel's shadowed interior. Riley froze. Colt grabbed her arm. "Tell me you heard that," he whispered. She nodded. Unable to speak, they stood in the ruined lobby as the footsteps faded into silence, and Riley felt the full weight of every warning glance, every whispered conversation, every fearful expression from the townspeople pressing down on her shoulders. She had bought this place for 50 cents, and now she understood why nobody else had wanted it. Riley returned to the hotel the next morning with flashlights, a camera, and a stubbornness that bordered on foolishness. Colt had refused to come back, citing work obligations, but Riley suspected the real reason had more to do with those footsteps they had heard. She had spent the night in a motel on the highway, lying awake and listening to trucks pass, while she tried to convince herself there was a rational explanation for everything. The morning light did little to make the riverside ground less unsettling. If anything, the sun illuminated details Riley had missed the day before. Claw marks scored several of the doors on the ground floor, deep gouges that looked like they had been made by something trying desperately to get inside or out. Strange carvings marred the wallpaper in the hallways, symbols that might have been graffiti or might have been something older, more deliberate. The patterns repeated at intervals, always at the same height, as if someone had marked the walls while walking a measured path. Riley photographed everything. Her old instincts as an investigative travel writer kicked in, that need to document and understand. The hotel's layout was more complex than it appeared from outside. Corridors branched at odd angles, some ending in locked doors while others opened onto rooms that overlooked the collapsed eastern wing. She found a dining room with tables still set with rotted linens, a ballroom with a stage where the remnants of velvet curtains hung in tatters, and a bar where broken bottles lay scattered across the floor like fallen soldiers. She was examining the bottles, trying to determine if any might be worth salvaging, when she heard a whimper. Riley spun, her flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. A dog stood in the doorway, a thin creature with matted fur and wary eye. It watched her for a long moment, then turned and trotted down the corridor. Riley followed, curiosity overcoming caution. The dog led her through a maze of passageways to a section of the hotel she had not yet explored. Here the decay was worse, the floor spongy beneath her feet, the walls bulging with water damage. The dog stopped at a doorway and refused to go further. It sat down, whimpering again, and looked at Riley as if to say, "This is as far as I go." Riley stepped past the animal and shone her light into the room beyond. It had been a guest room once, though the bed was overturned and the furniture broken. But what caught her attention were the markings on the floor. Not claw marks this time, but words scratched into the wood itself, cut deep with something sharp. She knelt down and traced the letters with her finger. "Help us," one message read. "They won't let us leave," said another. And in the center of the room, carved larger than the rest, "The guest is still here." A floorboard creaked behind her. Riley stood and turned in one motion, her heart hammering. An elderly man stood in the doorway, his weathered face showing surprise at her sudden movement. He wore work clothes that had seen better decades, and he held a ring of keys that looked like they belonged to another era. "Didn't mean to startle you," he said. His voice was soft, almost apologetic. "I'm Tom Kestrel. I used to be the groundskeeper here back before the place closed. Still come by sometimes to check on things." Riley let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. "Riley Hartman. I just bought the hotel." Kestrel's expression shifted, surprise giving way to something that looked like concern. "I heard about that. Folks in town have been talking." He glanced down at the carvings on the floor, and Riley saw his jaw tighten. "You shouldn't be here alone, Miss Hartman, especially not in this part of the building." "Why not?" He was quiet for a moment, as if weighing his words carefully. "This hotel has a history. Bad things happened here long before my time. The owners back in the 20s and 30s, they had arrangements with certain people. Not all their guests were the kind you put in the registry book." He paused, "and some guests never left." Riley thought of the footsteps from the day before. "Are you saying the hotel is haunted?" "I'm saying there are rooms you shouldn't open and questions you shouldn't ask." Kestrel looked directly at her then, and she saw genuine fear in his eyes. "I've worked here on and off for 40 years, Miss Hartman. I've heard things in these walls that can't be explained, seen things I can't rationalize. My advice is to sell the property and leave. Tonight, if possible. I just bought it yesterday. Then you haven't invested much beyond 50 cents and your pride." Kestrel moved past her and began pulling boards and debris away from a section of wall. "Let me show you something. Maybe it'll convince you I'm not just a superstitious old man." He revealed a door that had been hidden behind fallen plaster, smaller than the others, painted the same color as the wall to make it blend. The door had no handle, only a keyhole. Kestrel produced a key from his ring and inserted it, but he did not turn it. Service passages, he explained. The hotel staff used them to move between floors without disturbing the guests. Bootleggers used them too, to move product, when the law came calling. He withdrew the key without unlocking the door. As a boy, I saw someone being moved through these passages. A woman, or maybe a girl, hard to tell in the dark. She was wearing clothes that looked old even then, and the staff who carried her looked terrified. My father worked here as a janitor. He saw me watching and told me to forget what I saw, said it was for my own good. When was this? I was 8 years old. Kestrel turned away from the door. That was 65 years ago, Miss Hartman. I'm 73 now, and I've never forgotten it. Never will. The hotel closed down about 15 years after that, and nobody's lived here since. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear sounds from inside, footsteps in empty halls, someone knocking on doors that don't exist anymore. Riley felt cold despite the warm summer air. You're saying someone's been living in the walls for 60 years. I'm saying you should leave. Kestrel walked toward the exit, his keys jangling. Don't stay here overnight, Miss Hartman. Don't go into the service passages. And if you hear knocking, don't answer. He left her standing in the ruined guest room, with her flashlight and her questions, and the dog that still refused to cross the threshold. Riley looked at the hidden door for a long time, thinking about what Kestrel had said. A guest who never left. Messages carved into the floor. Arrangements with certain people. That night, alone in her motel room, she would remember his warning, and she would ignore it completely. Riley moved into the hotel on the third day, despite every rational voice in her head, screaming at her to reconsider. She told herself it was practical. The motel was expensive, and she needed to be on site to assess the full extent of the repairs needed. She told herself she was not afraid of ghost stories. She told herself a lot of things that felt less true with each passing hour. She set up a camping cot in the lobby where the ceiling seemed most stable, and she kept her flashlights within arm's reach. Colt had driven up again to try to talk sense into her, and when that failed, he brought her a portable heater, a case of water bottles, and a baseball bat. For rats, he said, though they both knew what he really meant. He stayed until evening, helping her clear debris and test which rooms were structurally sound enough to enter. They worked mostly in silence, and Riley was grateful for his presence, even when he shot her looks that clearly said, "I told you this was a bad idea." As the sun set, Colt made one last attempt. "Come back to town with me. We can come back tomorrow during daylight hours." "I need to do this," Riley said. "I need to prove I can see something through, without running away." Colt opened his mouth, closed it, then shook his head. "You're not running away if you leave a death trap, Riley. You're being smart." But he hugged her anyway before he left, holding on a moment longer than usual. "Keep your phone charged. Call me if anything happens." Riley watched his truck disappear into the darkness, its taillights winking out around the bend. Then she was alone with the hotel and the sound of the river moving past in the dark. The first few hours were not so bad. Beam of her flashlight, she could see that the paint was old and peeling, and scratches marked the frame as if fingernails had clawed at it from the other side. She tried the door, locked. The knocking came again. Closer now, definitely from the other side of this door. Riley examined the lock, an old mechanism that would require either the key Kestrel had or a significant amount of force. She chose force. 3 strikes with the bat splintered the wood around the lock. Riley felt a moment of guilt about damaging her own property, followed by a surge of determination. One more hit, and the door swung inward, revealing darkness and the smell of stale air and something else, something human and close. "Hello," Riley called into the darkness. The knocking stopped. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, so faint Riley almost missed it, a voice responded. "Please," the voice said. It was thin and rasping, as if it had not been used in a very long time. Please help me. Riley's blood turned to ice. The voice was coming from deep within the service passage, from somewhere in the walls of the hotel. She stepped forward, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, and she could see stairs descending into blackness, and a corridor beyond that, and shapes that might have been furniture or might have been something else entirely. "Who are you?" Riley asked. "Please," the voice said again, and now Riley could hear the desperation in it, the fear, the exhaustion of decades. "I can't get out. They won't let me leave. Please, you have to help me. You have to tell someone I'm here." Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Riley stood at the threshold of the service passage with her flashlight and her bat and her racing heart. Behind her was the ruined lobby, the world she knew, the safety of retreat. Before her was darkness and mystery and a voice that should not exist. She thought of the messages carved into the floor. The guest is still here. And Riley Hartman, who had lost everything chasing the truth once before, stepped into the passage and followed the voice deeper into the walls of the Riverside Grand Hotel. The service passage was narrower than Riley had expected, its walls pressing close on either side like a throat swallowing her whole. Her flashlight beam revealed water-stained wallpaper, peeling in long strips, and exposed pipes that dripped steadily into pools of standing water. The air smelled of mildew and decay, and something underneath that reminded Riley of nursing homes, that particular scent of human habitation, compressed into too small a space for too long a time. "Keep talking," Riley called into the darkness. "I'm following your voice." "Down the stairs," the woman said. Her voice was clearer now, less rasping. "At the bottom, turn left. There's a room. I'm in the room." Riley descended the stairs carefully, testing each step before putting her full weight on it. The wood groaned but held. At the bottom, she found herself in a corridor that ran parallel to the hotel's main floor, a hidden artery that would have allowed staff to move unseen through the building. Doors lined both sides, most of them locked or swollen shut with moisture. But one stood slightly ajar, and pale light flickered from within. Riley pushed the door open. The room beyond was small, barely larger than a closet, with a low ceiling and no windows. A camping lantern sat on an overturned crate, its battery-powered glow illuminating a space that looked like it had been inhabited for a very long time. Blankets were piled in one corner to form a makeshift bed. Canned goods lined makeshift shelves, some labels so faded Riley could not read them. Books were stacked against one wall, their pages yellowed and brittle, and in the center of the room, sitting on a wooden chair that might have been salvaged from the hotel above, was a woman who should not exist. She was old, her face deeply lined, her white hair hanging loose around her shoulders. She wore clothing that looked decades out of date, a dress that might have been fashionable in the 1960s, now worn thin and patched with mismatched fabric. But her eyes were sharp and alert, watching Riley with an expression that mixed hope with terror. "You're real," the woman whispered. "I thought I might be dreaming again." Riley could not find words. She stood in the doorway, trying to reconcile what Tom Kestrel had told her with the reality before her. A woman, living in the walls, not a ghost or a legend, but flesh and blood and fear made manifest. "My name is Agnes," the woman said. "Agnes Vale. I've been here since I was 12 years old when they brought me down here and told me I could never leave." The numbers did not make sense at first. Riley's mind struggled with the calculation. 1963 to 2025. 62 years. Agnes would be 74 years old now, assuming she was telling the truth about her age when she was hidden. "Who brought you here?" Riley managed to ask. Agnes's face tightened with old pain. "Men who wanted my father silenced. My father was going to testify about what he knew, about the people who ran this town during Prohibition, and after, the bootleggers and the crime families who controlled everything. They couldn't touch him directly without drawing attention, so they took me instead. Told him if he spoke, I'd disappear forever." She looked down at her hands, which trembled slightly in her lap. He died of a heart attack 3 months later. Never said a word. And I've been here ever since. Riley felt her legs weaken. She sat down heavily on the floor, her back against the doorframe. But that's impossible. Someone would have found you. The hotel staff. The guests. Someone. Some of the staff knew, Agnes said. In the beginning, they brought me food and supplies. They were terrified, but they couldn't let me starve. Over the years, fewer and fewer people knew I was here. They'd quit or move away or die, and eventually there was only old Tom, checking on me once a month, bringing what he could without raising suspicion. Her eyes filled with tears. When the hotel closed, I thought someone would finally find me. But they just boarded up the doors and left. Tom kept coming, but he's old now. Sometimes weeks go by between his visits. I've been so alone. Riley pulled out her phone. No signal this deep in the building. But that did not matter. I'm calling the police. We're getting you out of here right now. No. Agnes's voice cracked with sudden fear. She half rose from her chair, her hands reaching out in a desperate gesture. You can't involve the authorities. They're part of it. The sheriff's department, the town council, they all know. Their families have always known. If you tell them, they'll make sure I disappear for real this time. That's paranoid. This is 2025, not 1963. Things have changed, have they? Agnes sat back down slowly. The town is still run by the same families. Ephraim Vale is on the town council now. His grandfather was one of the men who put me down here. Do you think he wants the truth to come out? Do you think any of them do? Riley thought about the auction, about the way the townspeople had looked at her when she won the hotel. Not just superstition, knowledge. They knew something was here, something that should stay buried. And she had just unearthed it. I need to think, Riley said. I need to figure out the right way to handle this. Please don't leave me here. Agnes's voice broke. I've been alone so long. Please. Riley looked at the old woman, at the makeshift room that had been her prison for longer than Riley had been alive, and she made a decision that would change everything. Pack whatever you need, Riley said. You're coming upstairs with me. Riley had managed to get Agnes settled on a cot near her own before exhaustion overtook them both. The old woman had fallen asleep almost immediately, her breathing shallow but steady. Riley had stayed awake, watching her, trying to process the impossibility of what she had found. When dawn finally came, she called Colt. He arrived within the hour, his truck spitting gravel as he skidded to a stop in the circular drive. Riley met him at the door and watched his face cycle through disbelief, shock, and finally a grim acceptance as she explained what she had discovered. This is insane, Colt said, running his hand through his hair. This is absolutely insane. We need to go to the FBI, the state police, someone. Agnes says they won't help. She says the town is still controlled by the same families. Then we go over their heads. We call a lawyer. We call journalists. We make this so public they can't bury it again. Colt looked at Agnes, who had woken and was watching them with wary eyes. Ma'am, I'm sorry for what happened to you, but my sister's right. We need to get you proper help, medical attention, legal protection. They won't let that happen, Agnes said quietly. They've kept me hidden this long. They won't let me tell my story now. Riley was about to respond when she heard a car approaching. Not Colt's sec, but something else. Something expensive sounding. She moved to the window and saw a black sedan pulling up to the hotel, its polished surface gleaming in the morning sun. A man stepped out, tall and well-dressed, his silver hair perfectly styled. He moved with the confidence of someone who owned everything he saw. Who is that? Riley asked. Handsome, if not for the calculating coldness in his eyes. He smiled when he saw her, a practiced expression that did not reach those eyes. Miss Hartman, I presume, he said, extending his hand. Ephraim Vale, I apologize for the early visit, but I wanted to welcome you to our community. Riley shook his hand briefly. His grip was firm. almost aggressive. "Thank you. I wasn't expecting visitors." "I'm sure you weren't." He glanced past her into the lobby. "May I come in? I have a business proposition that might interest you." Every instinct told Riley to refuse, but she needed to know what he wanted. She stepped aside and let him enter. Vale walked through the ruined lobby like he owned it, his shoes clicking on the broken marble tiles. He studied the grand staircase, the collapsed ceiling, the water damage that streaked the walls. "It's worse than I thought," he said. "This building is a liability, Miss Hartman. It should have been demolished years ago. I didn't buy it to demolish it. I planned to restore it." Vale turned to face her, and his smile had grown sharper. "With what resources? You're a former journalist with no construction experience and limited funds. This hotel would cost millions to repair properly. You'll bankrupt yourself trying. How do you know what I am? This is a small town. We make it our business to know who comes here and why." He pulled a business card from his pocket and handed it to her. "I'm prepared to make you a generous offer. I'll buy the property from you for $50,000. That's 100,000 times what you paid for it. You walk away with a profit and no headaches." Riley looked at the card. "Vale Development Corporation. What would you do with the hotel? Tear it down, build something useful, condominiums perhaps, or a small shopping center, something that benefits the community instead of standing here rotting." He moved closer, and Riley had to resist the urge to step back. "This building has a dark history, Miss Hartman. Bad things happened here. The longer you stay, the more you'll learn that some stones are better left unturned." "Is that a threat?" "It's friendly advice." Vale's smile never wavered. "I'd hate to see you get hurt. Old buildings can be dangerous. Floors collapse, walls cave in, people have accidents." The menace in his voice was barely concealed. Riley felt her jaw tighten. "I'm not selling. You should reconsider. I'm offering you a way out. Take it." "I said no." Vale's expression hardened. The pretense of friendliness vanished, and Riley saw the man beneath the polish, cold and dangerous. "You have no idea what you're interfering with. This hotel should stay closed. If you persist in digging through its ruins, you'll regret it." "Get out," Riley said. Vale studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I've made my offer. When you change your mind, and you will, you know where to find me." He walked to the door, then paused. "One more thing, Miss Hartman. If you found anything unusual in this building, anything at all, I strongly suggest you keep it to yourself. There are people in this town with long memories and longer reach. We protect what's ours." He left without waiting for a response. Riley watched through the window as his sedan pulled away, and she knew with absolute certainty that Agnes had been right. This was bigger than she had imagined, and she had just made a very powerful enemy. The police arrived 3 hours later, not a full squad, just a single patrol car that moved up the drive slowly, deliberately, as if announcing itself. Riley had spent those hours arguing with Colt about what to do next. He wanted to take Agnes and run, get her to another state before the Vale family could react. Riley wanted to stand her ground, to document everything and force the truth into the open. They had reached no agreement when Deputy Vega knocked on the door. She was younger than Riley expected, maybe late 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that had seen too much to trust easily. Her uniform was crisp, her badge polished, but her expression was carefully neutral in a way that made Riley immediately wary. "Miss Hartman, I'm Deputy Elena Vega. I need to ask you a few questions about your property." "What kind of questions? May I come in?" It was phrased as a request, but the tone suggested it was not really optional. Riley led her into the lobby, where Colt stood with his arms crossed, radiating hostility. Vega glanced at him briefly, then focused on Riley. "We received a complaint that you've been disturbing the structural integrity of this building, breaking doors, removing boards from condemned areas. That's dangerous, Miss Hartman. The county has safety regulations for abandoned structures. I own this building. I can do what I want with it. Within reason." Vega pulled out a notepad. Have you found anything unusual during your explorations? Any evidence of previous occupancy? The question was too specific. Riley felt her pulse quicken. Like what? Homeless people sometimes squat in abandoned buildings. Drug users. We need to know if anyone's been living here illegally. I haven't seen anyone. Vega's eyes narrowed slightly. Are you sure? Because if someone is hiding on your property, you could be liable, legally and financially. I said I haven't seen anyone. The deputy circled the room slowly, her gaze taking in every detail. Riley noticed she avoided looking at the hidden door behind the staircase, almost deliberately. When Vega spoke again, her voice had dropped lower. Miss Hartman, let me be clear, this hotel has a reputation. People in this town have strong feelings about it. If you're smart, you'll sell and leave before those feelings turn into action. Is that a threat? It's a warning from someone who's trying to help you. Vega finally looked directly at Riley, and for a moment, something human flickered in those professional eyes. Fear, maybe, or regret. There are things in this town that don't get talked about. History that's been deliberately buried. You keep digging, you won't like what you find. And you won't be protected. You're a police officer. Protecting people is literally your job. My job is to maintain order, and sometimes order means leaving the past alone. Vega put her notepad away. I've delivered my warning. What you do with it is up to you. After she left, Colt exploded. That was not a wellness check. That was intimidation. They know, Riley. They know you found something. Riley nodded slowly. She moved to the window and watched Vega's patrol car disappear, defer the road. Tom Kestrel, she said. He must have told someone. He's been coming here for years to check on Agnes. He would have noticed she was gone. Or Vale has this place watched. He could have seen us moving her. They found Agnes sitting on her cot, her face drawn with fear. I told you, she said. They won't let me speak. They never have. Riley knelt beside her. We're going to find a way out of this. I promise. But that night, as Riley tried to sleep with one eye open and her phone clutched in her hand, she realized how empty that promise might be. They were up against an entire town, generations of conspiracy and silence, and she had no idea how to break it. When morning came, Agnes was gone. Riley woke to find the cot empty and cold. Agnes's blankets lay in a heap on the floor, and the camping lantern Riley had given her was overturned, its light still burning weakly. She called for Colt, who had spent the night in his truck, and together they searched the hotel's ground floor. No sign of Agnes, no note, no indication of where she might have gone. The service passages, Colt said. Maybe she went back down there. Maybe she felt safer. They searched for hours, calling Agnes's name into the darkness, checking every room and corridor they could access. The hidden door behind the staircase stood open, and Riley's flashlight revealed footprints in the dust leading down the stairs. But they were not Agnes's prints. These were larger, heavier, the treads of work boots pressed into the grime. Someone took her, Riley said, her voice shaking. Someone came in during the night and took her. Colt examined the prints more closely. More than one person. Look, there are 2 different tread patterns. They knew exactly where to find her, Riley. They came prepared. Riley felt sick. She had promised to protect Agnes, and she had failed. The old woman had survived 62 years in hiding, only to disappear the moment Riley brought her into the light. We have to call someone. State police, FBI, anyone. And tell them what? That a woman who's been legally dead for decades was living in your hotel and now she's missing? They'll think we're crazy. Colt ran his hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration he shared with his sister. We need evidence. Something concrete that proves Agnes existed and that crimes were committed. They were still arguing when the stray dog appeared. It stood in the doorway of the lobby, the same animal that had led Riley to the hidden passages days before. It watched them for a moment, then turned and trotted toward the back of the hotel, toward the collapsed eastern wing. When they did not follow immediately, it returned and barked once, sharp and insistent. "I think it wants us to follow," Riley said. "A dog. We're taking investigative advice from a dog." But they followed anyway. The animal led them through corridors Riley had not yet explored, past rooms that reeked of mold and decay, until they reached a door that opened onto the ruins of the collapsed wing. The dog stopped at the threshold and refused to go further, just as it had done before. Riley and Colt picked their way through the rubble carefully. The eastern wing had been the oldest part of the hotel, built closest to the riverbank. When it collapsed, it had taken with it several floors and a large section of the foundation. What remained was a jumble of broken brick, rotted timber, and twisted metal. The dog barked again, and Riley followed the sound with her eyes. There, partially hidden beneath a fallen beam, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Fabric, dark and tattered, the same material that had been used in older clothing. She moved closer and found not one piece of fabric, but several, arranged in what looked like shallow depressions in the earth. "Colt," she called, "come look at this." Her brother joined her and sucked in a sharp breath. "Are those what I think they are?" Riley began clearing away debris with her hands. Beneath the fabric and the dirt, she found bone. Old bone, yellowed with age, arranged in unmistakably human configurations, and not just one set of remains. As they carefully uncovered more of the site, they found evidence of multiple burials, all shallow, all hastily done, all hidden beneath the ruins of the hotel's collapsed wing. "This is a graveyard," Colt whispered. "They've been burying people here." Riley found something else, a small leather wallet, its contents protected by the oilskin it had been wrapped in. Inside were identification papers from the 1960s, a driver's license for a man named Robert Fontaine. She checked the other graves and found more identification, more names, more evidence of people who had vanished without explanation. "The guest is still here," Riley said, remembering the carved message. "But she wasn't the only one. They've been disappearing people for decades. Anyone who asked too many questions, anyone who threatened to expose what they knew." She pulled out her phone and began photographing everything. The bones, the documents, the layout of the burials, evidence that could not be dismissed or explained away, evidence that would force someone somewhere to pay attention. Colt grabbed her arm. "Riley, we need to be careful. If they took Agnes, if they killed all these people, what makes you think they won't kill us too? Because we're going to make sure everyone knows what we found before they get the chance." Riley finished photographing and stood up. "We're going to the county seat. We're going to find a news station, a newspaper, anyone who'll listen. We're going to make this public. And Agnes..." Riley looked at the shallow graves, at the evidence of generations of silence and death. "We find her by exposing them. They can't keep her hidden if the whole world is watching." But as they turned to leave, Riley saw something that made her freeze. Fresh tire tracks in the soft earth near the riverbank, and footprints, multiple sets, all leading away from the hotel toward the water's edge. Someone had been here recently, someone who knew they would find this place. And somewhere out there, Agnes was still missing, still in danger, while the clock continued to count down toward whatever the Vale family had planned next. Riley and Colt worked through the afternoon, carefully documenting every grave they found. The count had risen to 7 distinct burial sites, each containing remains that appeared to be decades old. Some had identification, others had only scraps of clothing or personal effects that spoke of lives interrupted and forgotten. Riley photographed everything with meticulous care, knowing that this evidence would be their only protection against whatever came next. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon when Tom Kestrel appeared at the edge of the ruins. He looked older than he had days before, his face drawn with exhaustion and something that might have been shame. He stood among the rubble and stared at the exposed graves without speaking. "You knew," Riley said. It was not a question. Kestrel nodded slowly. Not all of it. Not the extent, but I knew some people who came here never left. He moved closer, his work boots crunching on broken brick. My father told me before he died. He'd been part of it in the early days, back when the bootleggers ran things. They'd bring people here who knew too much or talked too loud. The hotel had agreements with certain families. Rooms that were never registered, guests who didn't exist in any ledger. He looked at Riley with haunted eyes. He made me promise to check on the girl. Agnes said she was the only innocent one, that she deserved to survive even if no one else did. You just kept her locked in the walls for 60 years. Colt's voice was harsh with anger. You could have gone to the authorities, gotten her out, and gotten her killed, along with my own family. Kestrel sat down heavily on a chunk of fallen masonry. You have to understand, this town runs on silence. The Vales, the Fontaines, the Mackridges, all the old families who built their fortunes during Prohibition, they have people everywhere. Police, judges, county officials, anyone who tried to speak up disappeared. These graves prove it. He gestured at the burial sites. I did what I could. I kept Agnes alive. I brought her food and books and human contact. It wasn't freedom, but it was survival. Riley wanted to rage at him, to blame him for his complicity, but she saw the weight of decades pressing down on his shoulders. Kestrel had been a boy when this started, caught in a web he had not woven. Where is she now? Where did they take her? I don't know. I came here as soon as I heard she was gone. Kestrel stood up, his knees creaking. But if Ephraim Vale has her, there are only a few places he'd take her. The old Vale mansion has cellars that go deep, or there's the warehouse district by the river, buildings his family owns that nobody goes near. We need to search both, Riley said. She turned to Colt. Call the state police. Tell them everything. Send them these photos. Colt pulled out his phone and checked the signal. No service out here. I'll have to drive back to town. That was when they heard the vehicles approaching. Not one car, but several, their engines loud in the evening quiet. Riley felt her stomach drop as 3 black SUVs pulled up to the hotel, blocking the driveway. Men stepped out, 6 of them, all wearing dark clothing and expressions that promised violence. And from the lead vehicle, Ephraim Vale emerged, his silver hair gleaming in the fading light. Miss Hartman, he called out, I believe you've found something that belongs to me. Riley's hand tightened around her phone. She had uploaded some photos to cloud storage, but not all of them. If Vale's men took her phone now, weeks of evidence could be lost. She glanced at Colt, who had moved to position himself between her and the approaching men. This is private property, Riley said, trying to keep her voice steady. You're trespassing. Vale laughed without humor. Private property? How quaint. He walked closer, his men fanning out behind him. You've been very busy, Miss Hartman. Disturbing things that should have stayed buried. Taking photographs of things that are none of your business. These are murder victims. That makes it everyone's business. These are old bones, old stories, old problems that were solved a long time ago. Vale's expression hardened. The only new problem is you, but that can be solved too. One of the men pulled a pistol from his jacket. Riley heard Colt inhale sharply beside her. Kestrel had gone pale, his hands trembling. They were trapped in the ruins with the river at their backs, and armed men blocking the only exit. I gave you a chance to walk away, Vale said. I offered you money, gave you warnings, but you couldn't leave well enough alone. Now you've put me in a difficult position. I need to know what you've found, who you've told, and where you've hidden your evidence. I've told everyone, Riley lied. Journalists, police, lawyers. The story is already out there. Vale smiled. No, it's not. I have people monitoring communication. If you'd contacted anyone significant, I would know. He gestured to one of his men. Take their phones, search them. The man moved forward, and Riley made a decision. Born of desperation, she turned and ran toward the collapsed section of the hotel, toward the unstable rubble and the exposed foundations. Behind her she heard shouting, the sound of footsteps in pursuit, and Colt calling her name. She scrambled over broken bricks and fallen beams, her feet slipping on loose debris, heading for the darkest section of the ruins, where the floor had collapsed into the old cellars below. She heard a gunshot and dropped instinctively, her heart hammering. The shot had not been aimed at her but fired into the air. A warning. Riley kept moving, reaching the edge of a gaping hole where the floor had given way. She could see basement walls below, water pooling at the bottom from decades of river seepage. "Stop right there," one of Vale's men shouted. "There's nowhere to go." Riley looked back and saw Colt being held by two men, Kestrel on his knees with his hands behind his head, and Vale walking slowly toward her, with an expression of cold satisfaction. She was out of options and out of time, and then she heard a voice from the darkness of the collapsed cellar. A woman's voice, strong despite its age, carrying across the ruins with the force of decades of silence, finally broken. "Let them go, Ephraim. This ends now." Agnes Vale emerged from the shadows of the ruined cellar, like a ghost taking solid form. She moved slowly but with purpose, climbing over rubble with the careful determination of someone who had spent a lifetime navigating the hidden spaces of this hotel. She was filthy, her dress torn and stained with dirt, but her eyes blazed with an intensity that stopped Vale and his men in their tracks. Agnes Vale breathed. The color had drained from his face. "That's impossible. You should be dead," Agnes finished. "Like all the others you buried here. I've been dead for 62 years, Ephraim. Legally dead, socially dead, a ghost in your family's walls. But I'm still breathing, and I still remember everything." Riley used the distraction to scramble back from the edge of the collapsed floor. She reached Colt, who was staring at Agnes with something like awe. Kestrel had risen to his feet, his expression transforming from fear to something that might have been hope. Vale recovered his composure quickly. "This changes nothing. You're a confused old woman with delusion. No one will believe anything you say. They'll believe the evidence." Agnes gestured at the graves around them. "These bodies tell a story. The identification Miss Hartman found tells a story. And I can name names. Ephraim. I spent 6 decades listening through walls, hearing conversations your family thought were private. I know where all the bodies are buried, literally and figuratively. You have no proof of anything. I have proof of my own existence. DNA tests will confirm who I am. Records from 1963 will show I disappeared. And once people start asking questions about me, they'll start asking questions about all of this." Agnes moved closer, and Riley saw that despite her age and her ordeal, she carried herself with the dignity of someone who had survived the unsurvivable. "Your grandfather put me in those walls. Your father kept me there, and you've spent your entire life benefiting from that silence. That silence is a fragile thing, Ephraim. Once it breaks, it shatters completely." Belle's face twisted with rage. He turned to his men. "Take her. Take all of them. We'll deal with this somewhere more private." But before anyone could move, another voice cut through the evening air. "Nobody moves. Everyone stays exactly where they are." Deputy Vega stood at the edge of the ruins, her service weapon drawn and pointed at Vale's men. She was not alone. Behind her, Riley could see the more patrol cars pulling up, their lights flashing in the growing darkness. State police vehicles followed, and behind them a news van with a camera crew that was already filming. Vega's face was pale, but determined. "Drop your weapons, all of you. Do it now." Vale's men hesitated, looking to their employer for guidance. Vale's expression shifted through several emotions: shock, calculation, fury, before settling on something like resignation. "You're making a mistake, Deputy. The only mistake I made was staying quiet for as long as I did." Vega's voice shook slightly, but held firm. I've spent my entire career protecting people like you, while victims suffered in silence. Not anymore, everyone on the ground. Hands behind your heads." The men complied slowly, their weapons clattering onto the broken bricks. State police officers moved in to secure them, reading rights in voices that carried across the ruins. The news camera captured everything, its lens sweeping across the exposed graves, the frightened men, and Agnes standing tall among the rubble like a monument to survival. Vega approached Agnes carefully, holstering her weapon. "Ma'am, are you all right? Do you need medical attention?" "I need to tell my story," Agnes said. "I need people to know what happened here. What was done to me. What was done to all of them." She gestured at the graves. "They deserve to be remembered. They deserve justice." "You'll get to tell your story," Vega promised. "I'll make sure of it." Riley felt Colt's arm around her shoulders, steadying her as the adrenaline began to fade, and her legs threatened to give out. She watched as Vale was handcuffed and led toward a patrol car, his perfect composure finally cracking as the reality of his situation sank in. Other officers were photographing the burial sites, marking them with evidence flags, treating the ruins with the respect of a crime scene. Tom Kestrel stood apart from the activity, looking lost. An officer approached him with questions, and Riley heard him begin to speak, his voice carrying the weight of a confession decades in the making. He would face consequences for his role, she knew, but perhaps there was redemption in finally telling the truth. As darkness settled fully over the Riverside Grand Hotel, floodlights were brought in to illuminate the scene. Riley watched Agnes speaking to the state police investigators, her hands gesturing as she recounted decades of imprisonment and survival. The old woman's voice never wavered, and Riley understood that Agnes had been waiting for this moment for most of her life. The moment when silence would finally break, when truth would finally emerge, when the dead could finally be mourned, and the living could finally be free. The guest no innkeeper dared to house had finally checked out. 3 months later, Riley stood in what had once been the lobby of the Riverside Grand Hotel and surveyed the transformation. The space was clean now, its broken marble repaired where possible and carefully preserved where not. The grand staircase had been stabilized and restored, its pineapple finials polished until they gleamed. But this was not a restoration to former glory. This was something different, something more important. The hotel had become a memorial. Where the collapsed eastern wing had stood, there was now a garden of remembrance. Each of the 7 victims found in the graves had been identified through dental records and DNA. Their remains had been released to families who had spent decades not knowing what had happened to their loved ones. In the garden, 7 stones bore their names and dates, simple markers that spoke of lives interrupted and never forgotten. Agnes Vale had become the face of the story that had captivated national attention. Her testimony, given over weeks of interviews, had exposed generations of corruption in the small town. The Vale family's empire had crumbled as bank gangs were frozen and properties seized. Ephraim Vale awaited trial on charges of kidnapping, conspiracy to commit murder, and obstruction of justice. Deputy Vega had been given a commendation for her courage in finally breaking the silence, though she had also faced disciplinary action for her years of complicity. Riley had relinquished any claim to the assets found in the hotel's hidden passages. Over the decades, the Vales had used the service corridors to store more than just Agnes. There had been cash, jewelry, documents detailing illegal transactions. Everything of value had been turned over to a victims fund, distributed among the families of those who had suffered at the hands of the conspiracy. The hotel itself had become Riley's purpose and her redemption. She had raised funds through a crowdfunding campaign that went viral, drawing support from people across the country who had been moved by Agnes's story. Historic preservation grants had followed, along with donations from survivors of other silenced crimes who saw their own stories reflected in these walls. Colt had stayed to help, bringing his mechanical skills to bear on the structural repairs. He had hired a crew of local workers, carefully vetting each one to ensure they had no ties to the old families. Together they had transformed the hotel from a place of secrets and shame into a place of truth and remembrance. Today was the official opening of the Riverside Grand Memorial and Education Center. Visitors would be able to tour the preserved sections of the hotel, learning about its history and the crimes that had been committed here. The service passages where Agnes had lived would remain accessible, maintained as they had been found, a stark reminder of the cost of silence. Educational programs would teach about corruption, complicity, and the importance of speaking truth to power. Riley watched as people began arriving for the ceremony. Survivors of other historical injustices, students interested in journalism and criminal justice, families of the victims, and Agnes herself, now 74 years old, moving slowly but steadily through the lobby with the aid of a cane. Agnes had spent the past 3 months recovering in a care facility, receiving medical treatment and psychological counseling. She had also been working with a writer to document her full story, ensuring that every detail of her ordeal would be preserved for future generations. The book would be published next year, with all proceeds going to organizations that fought human trafficking and wrongful imprisonment. "It's beautiful," Agnes said, reaching Riley's side. "I never imagined it could become something beautiful." Riley took her hand, feeling the fragile bones beneath the papery skin. "You made it beautiful, your survival, your courage, your willingness to finally speak. That's what transformed this place. We did it together." Agnes squeezed Riley's hand gently. "You could have walked away. You could have sold the building to Ephraim and taken your profit. But you chose to listen. You chose to believe. That's what broke the silence." The ceremony began with speeches from state officials, from victims' advocates, from Agnes herself. She spoke simply and directly, her voice steady despite the emotion behind her words. She spoke of the night she was taken, of the years that followed, of the hotel workers who had kept her alive, and of the moment Riley had finally opened the door and let in the light. When it was Riley's turn to speak, she looked out at the assembled crowd and felt the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on her shoulders. She thought of the auction, of winning a collapsed hotel for 50 cents. She thought of the fear in the townspeople's faces, the warnings she had ignored, the footsteps in the darkness. "This building stood for a century as a monument to silence," Riley said. "People knew what happened here, but they chose not to speak. They chose comfort over justice, peace over truth, and that silence allowed evil to flourish." She paused, letting her words carry across the crowd. But Agnes refused to let that silence win. For 62 years she survived when she should have perished. She remembered when she was supposed to forget. And when she finally had the chance to speak, she spoke for everyone who had been silenced. Riley gestured at the memorial garden, at the names carved in stone. These people died because of silence, but they're remembered now because someone finally chose to listen. That's what this place represents. Not just the horror of what happened, but the hope that truth can prevail if we're brave enough to seek it. After the ceremony, as the sun set over the river, Riley walked through the memorial one last time before the crowds dispersed. She ran her hand along the restored balustrade of the grand staircase, feeling the smooth wood beneath her palm. She looked at the plaques explaining the hotel's history, the photographs showing Agnes at different stages of her long imprisonment, the preserved service corridors that told their own silent story. Colt found her in the lobby, his hands dusty from helping set up displays. "You did good, sis, real good." "We did good," Riley corrected. "I couldn't have done this without you. Guess I'm glad you didn't listen when I told you to sell." Colt smiled, that rare expression that transformed his perpetually skeptical face. Mom would be proud. Riley felt tears prick her eyes. Their mother had died 5 years ago, before Riley's career imploded, before the move to this small town, before any of this began. but she liked to think her mother would have approved of what the hotel had become. A place of truth instead of silence, a place of healing instead of pain. As night fell, Riley locked the doors of the Riverside Grand Memorial and Education Center and walked to her car. She would return tomorrow to begin the real work of running the center, of welcoming visitors and teaching about the past. But tonight, she allowed herself to feel the satisfaction of completion. The hotel still stood, its facade illuminated by carefully placed lights that highlighted the Art Deco details. But it was no longer a place of secrets. The guest who had been hidden in its walls for more than 60 years had finally been freed. The dead buried in its ruins had finally been mourned, and the truth, so long suppressed, had finally been given voice. Riley thought of Agnes, safe now in her new apartment, probably sitting by a window and looking at the sky, something she had been unable to do for most of her life. She thought of families who finally had closure about their missing loved ones. She thought of the young people who would visit this memorial and learn that silence in the face of injustice was itself a form of evil. And she thought of herself, a failed journalist who had stumbled into a collapsed hotel and found her redemption not in wealth or fame, but in the simple act of listening to a voice that should never have been silenced. The Riverside Grand stood against the night sky, no longer abandoned, no longer forgotten. A monument and a warning, a tragedy and a triumph, a reminder that the past, no matter how deeply buried, will always find a way to surface, and that truth, once freed, cannot be imprisoned again. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.